For those of us who are just joining us, we're just reflecting on the great needs which exist in our community, how crazy the world is, and how it's all just a matter of time before crazy happens to us too. It's just to say, this is what this chapter that we're going to discuss from Barth today is about, and about how we can address the future cheerfully rather than with dread. So speaking of that future, I wanted to pray the collect for the first Sunday of Advent, because this is an Advent chapter about the coming of Christ in judgment. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Almighty God, give us grace that we may cast away the works of darkness and put on the armor of light, now in the time of this mortal life, in which thy Son, Jesus Christ, came to visit us in great humility, that in the last day, when he shall come again in his glorious majesty to judge both the quick and the dead, we may rise to the life immortal through him who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Ghost, one God, now and forever.
Amen.
So this is one of the most difficult chapters in the whole.
Oh, I'm so glad you said it.
It's one of the most
This
difficult
killed
chapters
me.
in the whole book.
Okay.
For those of you who are joining us, from Robin or Ellen, who are joining us live online, or for those of you who are watching the recording, everybody's nodding. This chapter 20, the coming of Jesus Christ, the judge, incredibly difficult. It's one of the most confusing parts of Barth's thought. Actually, his thinking about time and eternity, and also his thinking, this puzzle of how everything can be done, and yet we're still waiting for something. And how, what is that, right? He gets this, it's contained in the creed. There is the line, from thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. There seems to be something we're waiting on, but if Barth's telling of the story of God, the world, and everything, it's all done. It was all finished. It is finished. He says this in this chapter. The it is finished is final. When Jesus is on the cross in the Gospel of John, and he says it is finished, it's finished, it's done. And so Barth has to contort himself a little bit. He has to do some intellectual backflips in order to figure out, okay, so if it is finished, what are we still waiting on? If from thence, not from now, if from thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. If he will come to judge the quick and the dead in the future tense, what does that mean? What are we waiting on? What still has to happen if everything was finished in 33 AD?
Mm-hmm.
So this is both one of the most difficult parts of his thought to understand, period, his thinking about time. And it's also one of the most difficult theological circles for Barth himself to square. He's backed himself into a corner of some kind. In any case, I think his answer to this is really quite interesting. But we're going to have to, it would be not drudgery. The heart of this chapter is really how we can look to the future with cheerfulness and joy, notwithstanding the fact that we're all just like, we're the joke we were making before class is that we're all just one step away from being on the prayer list at St. Mark's. And crazy just happens all of the time. It happens to all of us in our time. But how can we look towards the future, not with dread, but with cheerfulness? That's the goal of what Barth is up to here. We just have to dig to find it. I'll also just say that these last chapters of the book are some of the most, Barth's moving very quickly, and I don't think that he is at his clearest in these chapters. So these are lectures which he's giving at the University of Bonn during the summer. He's come to the end of term, and those of you who have been in an academic environment, whether recently or otherwise, know that when you get to the end of term, you start to move faster because you have you got to make up your time, right? Barth spent how many lectures on Jesus's death on the cross? That's probably necessary, right? It's a big part of his thought. That's when the it is finished happens, right? So those chapters on the crucifixion and the resurrection probably needed to take so many lectures to do that. But maybe, I like to think he might have regretted spending 3 lectures on faith. Surely he could have condensed the second 2 into 1 or something like that. And did he really need all that boring prolegomena at the very beginning about what dogmatics is and so on and so forth? It's as though he gets to the end of the semester and, like every instructor, he realizes, oh my gosh, I have 6 lectures worth of material to cover in 3 lectures or something like that. So he's having to hurry up. And I'll also just say this is the section, this is the part of Barth's thought which is the most underdeveloped. His thinking about what we're waiting on. And I've already said a word about that. That's the corner that he's backed himself into. It is the most underdeveloped in the church dogmatics. In his systematic theology, his multi-volume version of this little set of lectures, he never wrote about it. He didn't get to that section. He died before he completed it, which in some sense is ironic because this is the man who says it was all finished in 33 AD. So there's really nothing else to say. In any case, he's moving very quickly. We're going to have to fill in some of the blanks for ourselves in these next few chapters. And we're also, I'll just tell you, I had some disagreements with Barth on some of these questions. Less so today, more so in 2 weeks. But I won't spoil it by telling you what my disagreement with Barth is, and how dare I disagree with the great Karl Barth, but I can't help it. So the coming of Jesus Christ as the judge. Let's talk for a moment. Let's not get too bogged down, but let's just talk for a moment about Barth's conception of time. Let's first talk about our conception of time. Time has three elements to it: the past, the present, and the future. Barth, like many thinkers in the 20th century in theology and philosophy, think there is something odd about our relationship to time. Not just that only 20th century thinkers thought a lot about time, but 20th century theologians, I think, addressed the problems of time in an interesting way. For much of Christian history, Christians have imagined eternity as the end of time, or the opposite of time, a kind of timelessness. When we use the word eternal colloquially, we use it to refer to something which never changes, right? If it's an eternal truth, it's a truth that never changes. It stays the same all of the time. There is no development. It's static. In the 20th century in particular, you have theologians who decided that actually eternity has a kind of time to it. Eternity is not static. Eternity has a kind of development. It has a kind of past and a kind of present and a kind of future. Eternity is not the opposite of time. It is time redeemed. It's time healed and restored. And when they did this, it meant that they were under pressure to explain why our current experience of time is fallen, why there's something faulty or defective in it. If eternity is going to have a kind of redeemed time, they have to explain, well, what is the time that needs to be redeemed? What is it about our current experience of time that needs to be fixed if eternity is the solution to its problems? The easiest way to explain what the problem is with our time is by thinking about the present and our experience of the present. So the present is always fading away into the past. Have you ever noticed how the present moment slips through your fingers, rather like you have a handful of sand and you just spread your fingers just a little bit and the sand just begins to fall away? That's what our experience of the present is like. I mean, as soon as you begin to think about the present, it's already the past. You never actually think, you experience the present, technically, like in the present is the only thing that you experience, but every single present moment, by the time you think about it, it's already the past. Mm-hmm. It's always slipping through your fingers. You can never hold the present. It's very hard to live in the present moment because the moment that you consider it, that you think about it, it's already the past. So that's one problem, the fleetingness of the present. And Barth himself uses this language to describe the present. On page 130, he says, he's referring to the time of Jesus Christ, has not the frightful fleetingness of our present. So he's referring to this, it's the sand not through the hourglass, but sand through our fingers. We never catch that little grain of sand in our hands. It's always beyond our hands by the time we can see it. In addition, the future is always coming at us, and the future is always ahead of us. We never grasp what the future is going to be. And this is the reason why it's actually appropriate. We began the class with some inside jokes about it's just a matter of time before we end up on the St. Mark's prayer list, because the future is unknown to us, period. Our futures are unknown to us. We don't have any knowledge. We don't have conclusive knowledge, to be sure, of the future. We can imagine what the future might be. We can try to predict it. We can extrapolate from our present circumstances in the past what the consequences of our present and past will be in the future, but it always comes to us unknown. There was a German philosopher named Walter Benjamin. He spelled his name Benjamin. And Benjamin depicted this aspect of history, the unknowableness of the future, by trying to illustrate it using a painting by Paul Klee. Those of you who know Klee's paintings know he can be a startling painter, and this painting is startling. It's a depiction of I think it's the title of it is Angelum Novum, something like that. It's a depiction of an angel. If you Google Paul Klee, Angel of History or Angelum Novum, the photo will come up. The angel, just to say, looks freaked out. And the angel's eyes are hard to say they're terrified, but they are they're not at peace exactly. At least Benjamin didn't think so. Benjamin said that our experience of time is like this angel. It's the eyes of bewilderment, because the angel has its back turned to the future. And it is being hurled in the direction of the future. Okay. So the angel is always being pushed into the future. The arrow of time is irreversible. Time only moves in one direction. Moves forward from the past to the present to the future. But notice the direction in which we experience time is the opposite. Okay, the arrow is going in the opposite direction on the board. We are being pushed forward, but the future is always coming to us, and the present is always fading away into the past. And Benjamin said it is like we are being pushed into the future with our backs turned to it. The angel looks bewildered and frightened because the angel is being rushed into the future and cannot see it. He has more to say about this depiction. He says that there is a storm caught up in the angel's wings, and that is propelling the angel into the future, dragging the angel into the future, and that this storm is what we call progress. It's a pretty enigmatic saying. He's ambivalent about progress. Anyway, a lot to say about Benjamin, but it's a really interesting, really interesting image for our experience of time. So there are problems with our current experience of time, Barth would say. The present is always fleeting, we can never hold it, and also we have our backs turned to the future. The future is always one step ahead of us, and it comes to us, and we don't know what it's going to be, and then it happens, and then it's gone. Have you ever, this is really why you woke up this morning to figure out why, like, every single moment of your life is difficult, okay? Every moment of our life is fallen. Barth would say that the fall has corrupted our experience of time. And this experience of time is broken every single moment. It's something that we're all accustomed to, but it's actually very hard to live with. It becomes harder to live with when you're in moments of extreme pain or sorrow or moments of extreme joy. In either case, I think you want to hold the present moment, right? And have you ever noticed you just can't? You try very hard. And you can acknowledge it, and you can acknowledge joy and thankfulness. You can try to keep perspective in sorrow. You can do the best that you can. But another philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche said joy wants eternity, wants sweet eternity. Joy, when we experience it, we want to hold it. We want it to be our future. We want it to be our present. We want to hold it, and we can't. It's always slipping through our fingers.
And I think as we age, it gets more difficult to let it go.
Say more about that, Eleanor.
Oh, dear.
What do you mean? What exactly?
Well, I think sometimes when things are joyous, we don't want to forget them. We just want to stay there. And maybe some part of us can foresee a little bit of what's going to happen in the future. And I'm like, I'm very happy here. I'm good to go. That's what I said. God, I'm good to go.
You're good.
But he doesn't
Draw
listen
the
to me.
veil on that.
Doesn't listen
Draw the veil.
Oh my gosh.
So you deal with what's coming up and happens, but
Yeah.
I kind of liked it better over here. And I think personally speaking, as I've gotten older, it's more difficult to leave sometimes I mean, sometimes we're happy to, but in general, to go to what's ahead.
It's really very interesting.
I personally, as I've aged, I find
Yeah.
change difficult.
This is where it really gets very confusing, the whole Jesus God thing.
Yeah.
Because I can understand what happens in the future happens. I mean, sickness and all that.
Right.
But the bad stuff that happens, is the devil causing that? I mean, is there such a thing? Did Barth believe in the devil?
So Barth believed in das Nichtige,
Yeah.
in nothingness,
Mhm.
in this this kind of vacuum-like force of evil, what we might call a third kind of being or non-being, right? If you've got God's kind of being and you have creation's kind of being, and you have this weird third kind of being, which is nothingness, which is always trying to suck the stitches out of creation, which is generated somehow by God saying yes to creation, and then there's a no implicit in God's yes, and then the no has a life of its own. Everything that God has not done, has chosen not to create, all this stuff somehow exists, has a kind of odd existence, and it's always threatening creation, etc. So he says that the biblical language around demons, around the demonic, around the devil, all of these things which thwart God's purposes, to which God says no, that is das Nichtige. Does Barth believe in the devil? Hard to say. Barth thinks it's a really clever insult to the devil to reduce the devil to a metaphor. He thinks that it's so Martin Luther said something to the effect of it's good to tweak the devil's nose every now and again, to kind of, because the devil's been defeated. If for somebody like Luther, for somebody like Barth, Jesus has fixed it all. We don't have to be afraid of any of this stuff. Yeah, it has some sway over our lives. It can even make our life, it can even ruin our lives on this level, but they can never actually touch what's most important to us. They have no effect on our ultimate destiny. Jesus has already beat them, etc. So we can be kind of playful and rude to the devil. And Barth thinks it's kind of rude to the devil. It would upset the devil to be reduced to the level of a metaphor. Now, whether that means Barth thinks that the devil is actually a being, a persona, a fallen angel of some kind, right? Who has an independent existence, who is an actual agent in history. But just that it's fun to insult the devil by reducing the devil to a kind of illustration of das Nichtige, of evil and so on. Or whether he just thinks that the devil is, that the language around the devil and the demonic in the scriptures is just metaphorical and there is no agent. That's, I don't know. And Barth can be interpreted in different ways. Regardless of whether you think the devil is a biblical metaphor or you think that the devil is an actual independent agent, regardless, the devil's substance, being, is that of this nothingness. He sometimes uses language of the demonic springs up from das Nichtige, springs up from nothingness and evil. So Barth does not think that everything that happens in the world happens according to God's will. He just doesn't. And neither does the Bible. This is something which I have realized with increasing frequency, having spent more time in the scriptures as I've been ordained longer and more time reading the scriptures with others, is that the Bible does not say that everything that happens in the world is God's will for the world. There are this stuff, demons, the demonic, etc., which are resisting God's will, which are gumming up the works of creation at the very least. Perhaps in some cases they straight up throw a wrench in the gears of creation and cause the machine to come to a halt or something like that. There's this biblical language of this stuff which is doing things in the world is not God's will. And that's ultimately what Jesus defeats on the cross, but it is not yet fully manifest that he's done so. So you can't look for Barth, you can't look at the world and assume that everything that is right, to quote the 18th century poet Alexander Pope, because not everything that is according to God's will. There is this force called Das Nichtige, perhaps a literal figure called the devil, or a force called the demonic. The prayer book uses the language of spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God and so on. There is this stuff which is also active in what our current state of affairs is, which acts in rebellion to God. God has defeated it, but it is not yet fully revealed that God has done so. Yes.
Well, I get the feeling with that, that it's back to this feeling that Christ came and to show us how he modeled the best way to be. And we're humans and we do our best, but we're never going to be Christ. And so it's sort of where we are when we are failing or getting out of the grace, the sort of living in the grace place, you can get off path. And it's sort of like, I had this image of people who have depression or people who have that, or an addiction. And the bad takes hold of you, and there is a way to get out of it, but that is sometimes harder to do than just to stay there. So, and I'm thinking in terms of that being like the evil in the world. But if we stay with faith and we stay in the grace place, we'll do better. And when we fall, it's almost like the evil is the void that's around the good.
That's very helpful, Cassie. Evil being the void that's around the good, that's actually helpful, because that void is what God is going to judge and which is going to go away at the end of time, according to Barth in this chapter. I also think that what you said about kinds of phenomena in which we get stuck in a ditch, so I think that human beings are comprised of mind, body, and soul, and that there are different forms of this being stuck in a ditch that characterize the mind, body, and the soul, right? And psychology addresses some of them. Psychiatry and can address the more physical parts of this. But there are certain kinds of darkness which belong to the spiritual realm. We would call those desolations, dark nights of the soul, something like that. And even in just to flag, even in the 16th century, with Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, or John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Carmelites, all of whom wrote very eloquently about this kind of spiritual being stuck in a ditch and not being able to get out. The spiritual sense of hopelessness. They distinguish between the spiritual desolation and something like what we would now call depression. They might call it melancholy or something like that. And so these are, whenever we're doing pastoral work with people, we urge them to attend to all three levels, right? To address the spiritual, yes, but also the physical and also the mental, right? We're whole people and we require whole forms of care. So it's good to fight things on every single front. And that's just a word mostly for people who might be watching this later and might have a question about that. But a big fan of psychology, a big fan of psychiatry. And I also think that there are versions of desolation which are spiritual in character and have to be addressed in a spiritual way, in addition to those two other levels. Bart, I want to come back to time here. So what Jesus does is Jesus redeems this experience of time and brings it into eternity. Eternity has a past, a present, and a future, but it's not a past and a present and a future like we experience past and present and future in our moment. It has none of the fearsomeness of an unknowable future towards which your back is turned, and it has none of the fleetingness of our experience of the present as it moves into the past. Somehow, the past, the present, and the future are distinct from one another, but they can all be held at the same time. They don't disappear into each other. The arrow is not exactly moving in that direction. It's more, if we've gotten rid of an arrow that goes from the future back to the past in our experience, it's more like you could draw like an infinity loop or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's how I.
Things, right? And you can hold the past, the present, and the future together. What the past and present and future refer to is the ever-present character of what Jesus has done for you and your connection to Jesus. Jesus' redemption of the world. So the past is, let's go to page 131. When we look back, Barth said, when the Christian community looks back, when we look towards the past and what happened in Christ at his first advent, his life, death, and resurrection, everything that happened between his birth and the year 33 AD, and then the 40 days after he was resurrected. It is not mere recollection, not what we call history. Okay, history is in like, you write it in a book, like Dear Diary, Father Justin gave a boring lecture today, period. It's not like that, because that's the past. You don't experience it, you can remember it, you can recollect it, but you're not experiencing it again. It's not in front of you. He says, rather, that which has happened once for all has the power of divine presence. What happens still happens, and as such, will happen. The point from which the Christian community derives with its confession of Jesus Christ is the same point as that which it goes to meet. And when the Christian community approaches the world, then its message at first glance has certainly the character of an historical narrative. It has the character of Dear Diary. In the year 6 of the Common Era, under the reign of Caesar Augustus, a man named Jesus was born in a barn/a cave in a town called Bethlehem, right? That seems like just history. That's something that happened in the past. It has the character of that. Then the talk is of Jesus of Nazareth, who suffered under Pontius Pilate after having been born under Emperor Augustus. But woe if the Christian message to the world were to halt at this event. The content and object of this narrative would then inevitably be a man who lived once upon a time, or a legendary figure to which many nations look back in similar fashion, one founder of a religion among others. Christ hath appeared must be proclaimed in its actuality over against the world as the thing in which the world too may hope, which world history too is going to meet. So the past, namely what Jesus has done for us in his life, in his death, and in his resurrection, this past, this it is finished, is always bursting into the present. So you might hear me preach from time to time that certain things happen in the world because the resurrection is kind of rushing up into the world. The power of the resurrection is, as Mother Ann Richards said, the secret engine of the universe. The resurrection is not just something which happened in the year 33. The resurrection is something which is happening all of the time. Not in the sense that it's being repeated all of the time. It's not that Jesus is being resurrected over and over and over and over and over again. It's somehow that his resurrection ripples out through the entire timeline of history in both directions and then can surge up into our present moment. The resurrection is always present. What Jesus has done for us is always somehow now, even as it was then. This past, Jesus' past, the it is finishedness of what Jesus has done for us, namely reconciled us with God, is always also present. And so when the Christian looks back to the past, they hold something which is true also for them, which is happening right then, which is effective right then in that moment. If they can finally get the piece of sand and they can hold the piece of sand in their hands. In addition, when we look forward, back on page 131, Christian faith could be regarded as expectation and hope, but this expectation could be of an empty and general character. One hopes for better times, better circumstances on this side, or in the form of another life in the so-called beyond. So what Barth is criticizing here, or what Barth is contrasting Christian hope to, is an unknown future. The thing about the future is that it's going to be different. People have a lot of hope in the future. I don't really, because the future as such, you don't know if the difference is going to be good or bad. You know it's going to be different, but you don't know. It could be change for the better or change for the worse. And it's most likely to be both, right? So I don't put my hope in the future. Putting your hope in the future is putting your hope in, I mean, it's just like putting your hope in the present or putting your hope in the past or something. It's just, the future is going to be just as full of changes for good and for ill as anything else. So I don't hope in the future as such. That's what Barth is describing as this, one hopes for better times, better circumstances. But one doesn't actually know if those better times or better circumstances are going to come about. One just knows that different times and different circumstances are going to come about. Likewise, he contrasts Christian hope with another life in the so-called beyond. So Barth doesn't set his hope in just the idea of another life, because he's like, is that other life going to be good? Is that other life going to be any better than this one? How do you know? How do you know that life is going to be better than this one? What if we're trapped? What if that other life is just a repetition of this one? Or God forbid, what if that other life is even worse than this one is? What gives you the knowledge that if you believe if you believe in life after death, that life after death is going to be any different than this one, not to mention better? All that you really know is that it's going to be different. He doesn't set he says that none of those things are worthy of hope, because you still got your back turned. You still don't know what you're being hurled toward. He says you can hope in Jesus, and you actually do know who Jesus is. And this is how he says the Christian can turn, right? We've had our backs towards our future. Now we can turn, we can turn around and we can face it. Our future is, guess what? It's still everything that was made possible by the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. The future is Jesus. The future is that God is revealed in Jesus. We know who this God is. We've gotten to know this God. We know this God's character, this God's personality. We know that this God is a God of love. We know that this God is for us. Jesus is our future. That's it. That's what it means for him to come to judge the quick and the dead at the end of time. Jesus is the future. And this is a future which is somehow the same thing which we already have in the present. This is Christian time, where the past, the present, and the future are all known to us. They're all revealed to us as love. They're all revealed to us as good and compassionate, as in our favor. They're all revealed to us as Jesus, and there are past, the present, and the future, which we have today, and which we can hold today, and which we can hold forever. So that's what he's trying to do, I think, in those first pages of chapter 20. I do want to speak about what he thinks is going to happen at the end of time, because arrow of time in this world is still moving in this direction. And Barth still believes that there will be a moment where this arrow of time comes to an end. The universe there will be a last day of some kind. So what does he think happens on that last day? We spoke last time about how Jesus comes. It's been a long time since I memorized these dates. He's born sometime between 10 BC and 10 AD. That'll be close enough for government work here. Scholars don't know exactly when he was born, because the Gospels of Matthew and Luke contradict each other. Quirinius was not the governor of Syria at the same time as Herod. the Great was reigning. That's basically, I think that's at least what I memorized for a quiz in my New Testament class. So he born sometime around the turn of the transition between before the Common Era and the Common Era, sometime around that. But like 10 to 10. And then he dies in 33. And then he's resurrected from the tomb. And then he ascends. And there's something like 40 days in between the resurrection and his ascension. And then we are living in this time in between the ascension and the end. He calls this the end time. So if anybody's ever asked you, are you living in the end times? Normally they're trying to sell you something, or they're trying to tell you, as some people did, commented on our podcast, that the world was going to end like last week on Thanksgiving. No kidding. This was a comment on our podcast last week. Bart would say, yeah, you're actually living in the end times. But he means by that something very different than what these other people do. What he means is that we live in the moment after Jesus has done everything that needed to be done. We live in a moment after Jesus has reconciled the world to God and fixed everything. We live in what he calls also the time of the word, by which he means it's a time of witnessing. The church's job in this time is to proclaim what happened right here, because what happened right here is not fully manifest until this moment. Or it uses the language of patience to describe God's relationship to this interim time between Jesus's death, resurrection, and ascension, and the end of time, Christ's coming in judgment. He says, on top of page 128, God has patience. God is still waiting. He has put the church into the world, and the meaning of this last time is that it is filled up by the message of the gospel, that the world has this command to listen to this message. This is what Christians are called to do. We don't have to do what Jesus has done for us already. We participate in what Jesus has done only by proclaiming that he has done. He's used the metaphor in chapter 9, I think it was chapter 18, to explain this, it is finished, but it's not quite revealed yet fully. As it's like when soldiers are still fighting at the front because they haven't yet received word of the fact that the peace treaty has been signed somewhere else. So there's still skirmishes going on, but it's actually all done. The war is over. It's been decided conclusively in favor of one side. Or he describes it as you're playing chess and you know that you got your opponent beat. There's nothing that they can do, but there's still a few more moves, but they're already beat. And you're still playing, but the game is over. And we talked last time about how that kind of moment when you're playing a game is sweet. It's the most fun. And I was talking about my real-time strategy video games that I played when I was a high schooler. And, the best time is when you know you got the beat. And so, you can run your army around and do whatever you want to because the other person's like, you're just waiting for them to say, GG, good game. That's it. And you're just waiting for them to say, yeah, okay, you got it. It's a lot of joy. It's a lot of fun. And he says that's the kind of joy that we should have when we move through creation. All this bad stuff which happens, all the reasons why you might end up on the prayer list of St. Mark's. It doesn't matter. It's just soldiers skirmishing at the front because they've not yet received word that the war is over, or it's Jesus has won the game. It's just Das Nichtige is not yet given up. Still playing, but is beaten. The role of the church is to say the game is won. For some reason, God has thought it would be a good idea to have an interim period where people could realize this for themselves, where people could know it for themselves. And it says God is patient. God doesn't need to win right away. God can win and then let the game continue for a little while. Now, this raises some questions about why God would think it would be worth letting the game continue, given the kind of terrible things which have happened while the game is still being played. mean, the Holocaust happened a long time after 33 AD. Patient? Why would God be patient with that? Well, I don't know. Perhaps one day God will tell us. Barth basically gives no answer other than that one. He barely even gives that answer. But Barth really believes that the game has been won, and the Christian job is just to tell everybody the game has been won. He says that this is hidden from the world. It's hidden from us even. We don't even have a complete knowledge of it in the church. He says, page 133 at the bottom, him, Jesus, we are expecting, he is coming, and he will be manifest as the one whom we know already. It has all taken place. The only thing wanting is that the covering be removed and all may see it. He has already accomplished it, and he has the power to make it manifest. And that's his interpretation of the New Testament language of the Son of Man coming on clouds with power and great glory. And also the language of as the lightning goes out from the east to the west, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. This idea, if you imagine, let's say you're out on the plains of Kansas, where I just got back from South Dakota, and certain parts of South Dakota are like this. If you can imagine, as Jim, Eleanor's husband, can imagine from personal experience, you're standing somewhere and you can't even, the horizon just disappears. It just kind of fades away. You don't actually, it's not like Connecticut with trees and everything like that. You can see forever.
Oklahoma's like that too.
Oklahoma's exactly like that. Put yourself in Oklahoma with the wind sweeping down the plain. You can see the storm coming from miles and miles and miles away. And when it's
tornado.
Yeah, that's frightening. But I prefer watching the thunderstorms than the tornadoes come from miles away. When it's dark and lightning strikes, it lights up the entire sky. And that's what the biblical imagery is talking about, Barth says. That's what it means that as lightning goes from the east to the west, not that literally lightning goes from the east to the west, but rather that the light of the lightning bolt, right? You have the lightning strike and it illuminates everything. Everything is bright for a moment. Barth says that's what happens when Jesus comes again. That's what happens at the end of time. What happened then, the it is finished, becomes readily aware and apparent everywhere, all at once, in a flash. And that consummates God's will for creation, that everybody would know. And somehow, in the end, Jesus, when he judges the world, I read him this way. It's a controversial reading of Barth. This is how I read this chapter and other parts of his work. There is I'll just say I love these passages on 134 to 136, where Barth is throwing shade at Michelangelo. Like if anybody could throw shade at Michelangelo, it could only be Karl Barth. The shade that he's throwing is that in the depiction of, so in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, there's a depiction of the Last Judgment, as well as many other things, right? But there's a depiction of the Last Judgment. And people love to depict the Last Judgment. We're a whole lot better at depicting the Last Judgment or depicting hell than we are at depicting heaven. Have you ever noticed that most people only read Dante's Inferno, they never get to Paradiso? Not mention the Purgatorio, which is very interesting. Jules really into the Purgatorio, but anyway, nobody ever gets to Paradiso. And the most common refrain when people read the Paradiso by Dante is it was boring. And this is partly because it's very hard to understand what's going on in the Paradiso. I don't understand what's going on in the Paradiso, but people who are much smarter than I am do. But it's also because I think that our imaginations are really bad at figuring out what heaven would be like, because heaven must be so different than what this is, than what our present reality is. But we can imagine hell because we have some knowledge of what eternal torture would be like, right? It would be like certain parts of this creation that we have an awareness of. People are really into depicting people being drugged down into the chasm of hell by little demons. And we watched Mozart's depiction of Don Giovanni, right? We're very good at imagining eternal damnation, and Michelangelo was very vivid. And you got demons that are dragging people down into the abyss, and that kind of thing. And you got Jesus up there and judging, and he's on his left. People who are left-handed get a bad rap in the scriptures. I'm sorry about that. But the people who are on the left are being drugged down into the hell. The people who are on Jesus' right are going up into heaven. He's going to separate the sheep from the goats, those on his left from his right, and so on. Here's the shade which Barth throws at that idea. Page 134. If we wish to understand aright, we must from the start repress certain pictures of the world judgment as far as we can and make an effort not to think of what they are describing. All those visions that the great painters represent them about judging the world, Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, for example, Christ advancing with clenched fist and dividing those on the right from those on the left, while one's glance remains fixed on those on the left. The painters have imagined to some extent with delight how these damned folks sink in the pool of hell. But that is certainly not the point. Question 52 of the Heidelberg Catechism asks, what comfort hast thou by the coming again of Christ to judge the quick and the dead? Answer, that in all my miseries and persecutions, I look with my head erect for the very same who before yielded himself unto the judgment of God for me and took away all malediction from me to come judge from heaven. A different note is struck here. Jesus Christ's return to judge the quick and the dead is tidings of joy. With head erect, the Christian, the church may and ought to confront this future. For he that comes is the same who previously offered himself to the judgment of God. It is his return we are looking for. Would it had been vouchsafed to Michelangelo and other artists to hear and see this? Jesus Christ coming again for judgment, his ultimate and universal manifestation, is often described in the New Testament as the revelation. He will be revealed, not only to the church, but to everyone as the person he is. He will not only then be the judge, he is the judge already, but then for the first time it will become visible that it is not a question of our yes and no, our faith or lack of faith. Very strong statement. It is not a question of our yes or no, our faith or lack of faith. In full clarity and publicity, the "it is finished" will come to life. So does Barth believe everybody is going to heaven? He certainly doesn't think he can say anybody's going to hell, because it's not a matter of our yes or no. The "it is finished" is the "it is finished." He does say there's something which God is going to say no to. Where is that? On page 136. That there is such a divine no is indeed included in this judgment. But the moment we grant this, we must revert to the truth that the judge who puts some on the left and some on the others on the right is in fact he who has yielded himself to the judgment of God for me and has taken away all malediction from me. I don't think he's saying like, well, at least I'm okay. At least I'm on the right side. Because he said earlier that all of humanity is contained in Christ. And so all of humanity has gone through is in Christ. We all go through the experience of receiving the judgment, undergoing undergoing the descent into hell, and then being raised again and being exalted with him. All of humanity is included in Jesus. So I don't think he could say, well, at least I'm on the right and the others are on the left. I read him as saying that, again, there is a something in creation to which God says no. That's das Nichtige, that's evil. And somehow that evil will all be done away with. And that's what the judgment is about. God will use language that Barth does not use. This is where I get controversial, but controversial. It may not seem controversial for people in the room, but Barth people would think it's controversial. I think that what he's referring to is the purgation of history, so that God will, in the last day, get rid of all of the bad gunk from the timeline of history. Not going to get rid of people, not going to get rid of humanity, not going to get rid of creatures, but it's going to get rid of das Nichtige. Everything that God has always said no to from the very beginning. That will all be done away with. So there are three things which happen at the end of time. One is that just as lightning illuminates from the east to the west, so also everybody will see Jesus for who he is. Everybody will realize everything that was contained in the "it is finished." It will no longer be hidden. The war will not just be technically over, it will actually be over. The second thing is that it will be shown that it's not actually a matter of our yes or no, our faith or lack of faith. It only has to do with Jesus's yes. It only has to do with Jesus's faith. It only has to do with what Jesus has done, and Jesus's "it is finished." Then the third thing I think is that nothingness and evil will be gone. Nothingness and evil will go away. And this will allow us to realize what Barth says on page 134, that our future consists in our being shown that all was right and good in our existence and in this evil world history, and miracle on miracle in the still more evil church history. The startling words there, but he's living after a moment where the Evangelical Church of Germany has been lost up with Nazism. He says we don't see it now. You can't see it in the newspaper. We will, everybody will see it. We will all be able to see it perfectly then. That actually everything is, and everything has been okay. Now, are we only going to see it after God has removed the nothingness from history? It's a little unclear. Will perhaps we be able to remember the nothingness of history and consign it not to this past, which is still present, but to the past as we currently experience it, stuff which we can recall, but has no power over us. It's no longer present to us. We no longer hold it. Perhaps, regardless, he says that somehow when we behold Jesus and we see all of creation and all of history, our history and the history of the world in relation to him, that which he has redeemed and perhaps also that which he has defeated, we will see that all is well. That's what's coming at the end. So you have your face turned towards it. You're not hurtling backwards into something which you don't know what's going to happen. You don't have to be worried that the next life is going to be worse than this one because you know who God is, Jesus. Okay.
Is this an individual thing, do you think? Or are we all going to have to wait till the end and do it together?
That's very interesting. So for Bart, it's very hard to, I don't think he would say, that when you die, you're waiting around. I think he would say, but I'm not sure. Again, this is where it's one of the vaguest parts of his thought. I think he would kind of say that everybody, when they die, they get fast forwarded to this moment.
I hope so.
Yeah, and somehow what's going on in this moment is also present to us in this world, right? Because eternity is not the opposite of time. It has a relationship to time. And Jesus is present to us now. This past, present, and future is somehow supposed to be experienced by us as Christians in this time, even as we experience the old time too. And so it's fast forwarded is not even the right way to put it.
I know what you mean.
But I don't think we're waiting around. So some people like Martin Luther believe that when we die, we go to sleep and we wait for the last day. We're just asleep for a long time.
That's okay too.
Yeah, that's okay.
Cryotherapy.
Yeah. People like Thomas Aquinas believe there was something called an intermediate state where you went either to hell, purgatory, or heaven.
Right.
And depending on how your time in purgatory went, you could, at the last day, you would be judged you'd be judged finally. You would then go to hell definitively or to heaven definitively. Barth doesn't have any such intermediate state because eternity is somehow already tracking with our current time. It just doesn't make, there's an in-between time in our timelines.
This is where the many mansions would be.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's an in-between time in our timeline in this world, but there's not. Jesus and the saints are not waiting around, I think. God's being patient with the world, but God's not exactly waiting.
Yeah.
So it's a very unsatisfactory question. I think he thinks that when you die, this happens. This is what you're going to experience. Everything he's just described. That you don't experience judgment twice, as it were. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, have thought, and other medieval theologians have thought there's a particular judgment, an individual judgment, and then a universal judgment at the end of days. And you get individually judged at your death, heaven or purgatory, and then everybody will be finally judged at the end.
But that's assuming that there's chronological time going
Exactly.
on. And so that it comes.
Exactly right. It's assuming that model assumes there's chronological time going on. And that's what Barth doesn't think. That's the point of all this really confusing past, present.
Oh,
Catholic.
There is a delusion. Only now Eckhart Tolle. So, it's the same thing. And that the resurrection happens every day within us. So we can experience Christ
Exactly right.
right now. And I think that's what he's saying.
I think so too. That's exactly right. It's exactly. More to say. I'm really excited that you said that. I just know we're running out of time. I want to let other people speak. It's fantastic. Yes, please.
But the one thing in John's gospel that always stops me is that people love their darkness. That statement. And that I contemplate that all the time, you know, when I'm experiencing the outer reality.
They love darkness rather than light.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then how does Barth address Kairos in any of this?
Yeah. So this is his depiction of Kairos. So what Linda's referring to is there's a biblical distinction between Kairos and Chronos. They're both forms of time, but Kairos is the time of God, the time of the Lord, and Chronos is our chronological, for which we get chronology.
Does he call this Kairos in his writings, or does he define it as this and not go back to sort of?
He might define, I don't know. It might be in the church grammatics. He doesn't do so in this chapter. At least not in the English that we've read. But this is what we would understand as Kairos as opposed to Chronos. This is his version of Kairos. And his version of Chronos would be the timeline and the arrow going backwards in our experience.
Yeah.
Anybody with the last word?
Amen.
Amen. It's really great. It is finished. Congratulations. And I'll see you next week.